Today, I want to examine the Apocalypse of Sedrach, and I want to discover how it fits into the genre of apocalyptic literature. While the apocalypse has some of the characteristics, some are missing. So, why do we call it apocalypse? Well, the first and the basic reason, of course, is the title. Either the author or some later transcriber named it such, the Apocalypse of Sedrach. It was written about 150 AD. The true author is unknown, but he claims to be writing the story of Sedrach. Now, one of the characteristics you'll remember is that these apocalypses are usually pseudonymous writings, that is, writings by an unknown person in the name of an ancient and famous personage. But who has ever heard of Sedrach? Well, this leads many scholars to believe that Sedrach is an alternate spelling, perhaps the Greek spelling of Shadrach. Now, Shadrach was one of Daniel's three companions in the book of Daniel in the Jewish scriptures, one of those who was put into the lion's den. Well, the book of Daniel, the second half, was written about 176 BC, and the first half, the biographical part, was written much earlier, probably or perhaps as early as 606 BC. So this would make Sedrach pseudonymous. It's divided into 16 short sections, and although they don't deal with the end times or eschatology as specifically as many apocalypses do, it does examine the end of an individual's life and discusses some important issues for the Christian lifestyle, such as the place of love and repentance and mercy. Chapter 1 discusses love, and it resembles significantly Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13. Let me give you an example. What grace do we possess without love? Our every deed is false. Even if one has virginity and fasts and keeps vigils and prays and gives a banquet for the poor. And if one brings gifts to God or offers the first fruits of all his goods or builds churches or does anything else without love, it shall be counted by God as nothing, for these things are not acceptable. So he also goes on in this first part to show that he's familiar with the writings of John when he says, how can one who does not love his brother whom he has seen love God whom he has not seen? So he's saying that hating your brother and saying that you love God, you're lying. And that's what John said. It's pretty much a quote. He makes a good case for the importance of love, ending with Christ as the ultimate example of love as he lays down his life for his friends. Now, on its own, this first chapter would make a good homily, and some scholars believe that it was just that, an independent text that was later combined with the rest of Sedrach, the more apocalyptic section that follows. So beginning with the next section, we're moving to the end of Sedrach or Shadrach's life. Remember, most apocalypses begin when a seer, a storyteller, has a vision and an angel comes to take him to the spirit world. So Sedrach hears a hidden voice in his ears saying that the angel understands Sedrach wants to talk to God. The angel says, I was sent to you that I may carry you up to heaven. Now, Cedric would like to talk to God face to face, but he knows that he can't fly, so he doesn't see how he can ascend to that position. But the angel, having stretched out his wings, took him and went up into the heavens and took him up as far as the third heaven, and the flame of the divinity stood there. So God speaks from the flame, and what follows is a series of discussions that Cedric has that are about issues that Cedric has with God's behavior. So his first issue is that God is unfair. He questions God's justice. A God created man, humanity, supposedly because of love, but knowing full well ahead of time that humanity was frail and weak and would sin. Yet he created him anyway and then punishes humans when they're deceived by Satan. Is that just? Cedric wants to know. And people today still struggle with this concept. In fact, this is the reason why some people believe in reincarnation, which seems to be a much fairer system that through many lives, people have a chance to improve and to work out their karma. So, why, Cedric asks God, why didn't you just destroy Satan? After all, he's the problem. No human is able to resist an invisible spirit. And if you couldn't destroy Satan, then why can't you just destroy the punishment for humanity instead? And what follows in just a few sentences is a very profound discussion about sin and God's justice. In including this discussion with God, the author uses the technique found in the Jewish book of Job, where Job contends with the Almighty and then receives back from God a list of the marvelous things that divinity can perform that Job can't. Now, the same with Cedric. Here's a sample. God says, since I created everything, how many people have lived and how many have died and how many hairs did they have on their heads? And tell me, Cedric, since the heavens and the earth have been created, how many trees have been made in the world? And how many leaves did they have? And how many waves have billowed onto the shore? And how many raindrops have fallen? Well, God is done with Cedric, and he sends Jesus to get Cedric's soul. Well, Cedric refuses to give it up. So here's another conversation between a celestial being, presumably this time God's Son or Jesus, and the human. So Cedric wants to know where in his body is his soul. And Jesus explains that while it is primarily in the center of your body near your heart, it actually basically fills up the whole thing. And when Jesus removes it, he tells him it's going to hurt. And he describes the process, how Cedric will actually feel his soul being pulled from underneath his fingernails and through the extremities of his body and up through his throat and out his mouth. Well, Cedric asks for a few moments to say goodbye to his body, and he writes what I would call a eulogy to the parts of his body, where he describes each one in tender terms as beautiful and wondrous. And finally, Jesus says to him, Stop, Cedric. How long will you shed tears and groan? Paradise has been opened to you, and after you die, you will live. Well, Cedric has one more argument to press, and this one is about repentance and salvation. And this is his question. If a person has lived most of the years of his life as a sinner and then repents, what is the acceptable time lapse between his change of morality and death? What if a person waits too long? What's considered too close to the end? In other words, how much time do we have? How long does one have to live a good life if they've lived in sin to be acceptable to God? Now, in early Christianity, when persecutions were first beginning, this was a major question for the church. What happened to those people who recanted their faith in order to avoid martyrdom? And if they later wanted to come back after relinquishing their faith, should they be let back into the church? Is this forgivable? And how long should the church wait before the person was reinstated, if they should be allowed back at all? And Shadrach is really asking a similar question of God. So God says 3 years. If a person repents and lives for 3 years a good life, they go to heaven. Well, now we're going to see that the author uses Abraham's bargaining techniques with the messengers of God regarding the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah back in Genesis. Remember how Abraham bargained with God. If you can find 50 righteous people in the city, will you spare the city? And then they went on to bicker 40 people, 30, etc. And I think Abraham finally got God down to 10 or 5 righteous people. He would not destroy the city. And this is an Eastern technique that you would find in the open air markets even today. Whatever the price of an item is marked, you're expected to bicker back and forth and see if you can't get that price to come down a bit. So this would not have seemed strange to Far Eastern people at all. And Cedric does the same thing. 3 years is too long, he says. What if a person dies before the time is over? So God goes to 2 years, and they continue the process. And when he finally gets God down to what he thinks is reasonable, and you'll need to read the Apocalypse of Sedrach to see what that is, what's the magic number, he asks for 2 more favors from God, and then he says he's ready to die. So God takes Cedric and puts him in paradise with the saints. And you can find the Apocalypse of Sedrach online, and I'll put a link to one of the places where you can find it. So let's review. There's a seer who's taken to heaven by a guide. The Almighty explains several hidden things through their conversation. We find out what happens to people when they die. Would you have called this an apocalypse, or perhaps some other kind of writing? Leave me a comment. I invite you to subscribe to this channel. I'd appreciate that. And I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll be uploading more interesting topics soon.